Story 1. The Shadow Dog of Route 66. Mac Duncan was no stranger to the open road. A seasoned truck driver, he'd spent the past 30 years traversing some of the longest and loneliest stretches of highway in America. But nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter along Route 66, and it all began one cold autumn night. Mac was hauling a late-night load out of California, headed for Missouri. Route 66, with its rich history and quirky landmarks, had always been his favorite route. But the road, with all its nostalgic charm, had a darker side. There were rumors, stories passed down by generations of truckers, of strange happenings on the mother road. Most were just that, stories. But this night, he would come to believe every one of them. It was close to midnight, the road shrouded in a dense fog that seemed to crawl out of nowhere, blanketing his truck in a heavy silence. The only sound was the steady hum of his engine as he cut through the mist. He adjusted the dial on his CB radio, trying to pick up any chatter, but there was nothing. It was like the road was entirely his. That's when he first saw it. A dark figure, low to the ground, appeared in his peripheral vision on the passenger side of his truck. He glanced over, expecting to see maybe a shadow from a tree or a trick of the light, but what he saw made his blood run cold. It was a dog, at least, it looked like one. The animal was large, almost wolf-like, with fur so black it seemed to absorb the light around it. It kept pace with his truck, running just outside the glare of his headlights, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Mac's heart pounded as he pressed down on the gas, wanting to get away from the thing, but it matched his speed effortlessly. As his truck picked up speed, he glanced at the road ahead, hoping to outrun the strange creature. But when he looked back, it was gone. He took a deep breath, trying to convince himself he'd imagined it. After all, fatigue played tricks on the mind. But he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered long after the shadowy dog had vanished. The next few nights were quiet, and Mac began to convince himself that it had been nothing more than an optical illusion. But just when he'd almost forgotten about it, the dog reappeared. This time, it happened on a desolate stretch of road just past an old gas station. Mac was cruising along, enjoying a thermos of coffee, when he caught a glimpse of the animal in his side mirror. It was there again, running alongside his truck as if it were taunting him. He could feel its gaze, intense and knowing, as if it recognized him. And just like before, as soon as he tried to speed up, it vanished without a trace. Mac's nerves began to fray. Every time he set out on Route 66, he'd spot the dog, lurking just beyond his headlights. It never attacked, never even got too close, but its presence was enough to make his skin crawl. He started to notice other signs, too, scratches on his truck door, faint paw prints on the ground beneath his tires, and a chilling silence that settled around him whenever the dog appeared. One night, after a particularly close encounter, Mac pulled into a roadside diner, desperate to talk to someone, anyone, who might know what was going on. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few weary travelers and an old man sitting at the counter. Mac ordered a coffee and took a seat next to him, and after a few moments of silence, he decided to bring it up. "You ever see anything strange out on this road?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The old man, who introduced himself as Sam, gave him a long, measuring look. "You been seein' the dog, haven't ya?" Mac felt a chill. "Yeah. It's like, it follows me. Keeps pace with my truck, just watching." Sam nodded solemnly. "You're not the first one. That dog's been haunting this stretch of Route 66 for as long as I can remember." "Why?" Mac asked, feeling an odd combination of relief and terror. "What's the story?" Sam took a deep breath and began his tale. Years ago, when Route 66 was first paved, a young truck driver had been making his way down the road one foggy night. He was new to the job, eager to prove himself, and had been pushing his truck to its limits. As he rounded a sharp curve, a stray dog darted across the road. The driver swerved to avoid it but lost control, flipping his truck. The wreck was so severe that he died instantly, along with the dog. Locals said the dog's spirit lingered, forever bound to the road where it had died. The truck driver's restless spirit was said to have been seen wandering nearby towns, never able to leave the place he'd met his end. Some believed the dog was guarding the road, a spectral warning to other drivers. Some folks say that if you see the dog, it means you're in danger, Sam said. It's like it's trying to keep you safe, in its own strange way. Mac shuddered. Was that what had been happening? Every time he saw the dog, he had a near miss with something, debris in the road, a sharp turn he almost didn't notice, a stalled car. As if sensing his unease, Sam placed a hand on his shoulder. You gotta respect the road, son. And if that dog shows up again, maybe you oughta listen. After that night, Mac took Sam's advice to heart. He found himself driving slower, paying extra attention to the road, even cutting back on his overnight shifts. But the dog didn't disappear. In fact, its visits became more frequent, each time lingering longer, as if it were checking up on him. One night, as Mac was driving through a particularly dense patch of fog, he spotted the dog again. This time, it was directly in front of his truck, standing in the middle of the road. Mac hit the brakes, skidding to a stop just inches from the animal. Heart pounding, he waited for it to move, but the dog stood its ground, staring up at him with those haunting, glowing eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to tell him something. He glanced out his window, and in the fog, he saw faint headlights coming toward him in the opposite lane. As they drew closer, he realized it was another truck, barreling down the wrong side of the road. If he hadn't stopped, he would have collided with it head-on. The other trucker swerved at the last moment, missing Mac by a hair. As the vehicle disappeared into the fog, Mac looked back at the road in front of him. The shadowy dog was gone. Mac never saw the dog again after that night, but he never forgot it either. He still took Route 66 now and then, always with an added sense of caution. And every so often, he would hear of other drivers who'd had similar encounters, a shadowy figure that appeared just in time to prevent disaster. Some called it a ghost, a curse, a bad omen. But Mac had come to believe it was something else. A guardian, perhaps, or maybe just a spirit bound to the road, trying to make up for its own tragic end. Whenever he passed that foggy stretch of Route 66, he would think back on that night, wondering if the dog was still out there, silently watching over the road and those who traveled it. And he would remember to say a quiet thank you, just in case it was listening. In the quiet solitude of the open road, sometimes the dead walked among the living, leaving signs of their presence in the most unexpected ways. Mac's encounter with the shadow dog lingered in his mind long after that close call. He found himself unable to shake the memory of those glowing eyes, watching him from the darkness. It wasn't just fear, it was curiosity. Why had the dog appeared to him? Was it a warning, a guardian, or something else? He found himself drawn back to the road where he'd seen the dog. This time, he was prepared. He started making nighttime drives along Route 66 again, searching for clues or signs of the dog. Maybe it was foolish, but part of him felt like he owed the creature his life, and he needed answers. As he made his way through the dense fog that seemed to settle around Route 66 like a shroud, he noticed subtle changes. Strange shadows danced along the roadside, and the silence was absolute. No animal sounds, no wind, nothing. Mac drove slowly, peering into the mist, searching. One night, as he was driving near the location where the dog had appeared, his headlights picked up a glint of something on the roadside. Slowing down, he noticed a set of rusted metal posts marking an old dirt road that veered off into the brush. Just beyond it, he caught sight of a half-hidden plaque. Curious, he pulled over and walked over to the plaque, brushing away years of dust and grime to reveal the words engraved upon it. In memory of Joseph "Joey" Delgado and his loyal companion, Sam. A chill ran down Mac's spine. This was the very stretch where he'd nearly collided with the oncoming truck. The night Sam in the diner had warned him about. Could this plaque mark the resting place of the dog that had saved him? Mac returned to his truck, his mind racing. He felt as though he'd been drawn here for a reason, to uncover something that lay buried in Route 66's dark history. Over the next few weeks, Mac dug deeper, piecing together Joey Delgado's tragic story. Joey had been a young trucker, much like himself, who'd been driving late one night with his dog, Sam, a stray he'd taken in as a companion. According to local legends, Joey had tried to avoid hitting another stray dog on that same foggy stretch, causing him to swerve and crash. Sam had been found nearby, still waiting by his fallen master's side. Mac felt a profound connection to Joey and Sam's story, as if he were reliving a ghost's final, unfinished journey. There was one more detail that the old man at the diner had shared. They said Joey's ghost wandered the foggy nights, unable to rest. His spirit, tethered to the road, kept searching for a way to save others, perhaps as a way to ease his own fate. Sam's spirit, loyal even in death, had taken on the role of guardian over the road, protecting travelers from harm. Mac felt humbled by the story. But as he continued his nightly drives, something strange happened. Each time he saw the dog, its presence grew closer, less shadowy, and more defined. He could see its black fur, sleek yet ragged, and the intensity of its gaze. He began to feel a peculiar warmth in its eyes, like a silent companionship. One night, during a particularly heavy fog, the dog appeared again. But this time, instead of trailing alongside his truck, it ran directly in front of him. Mac slowed down, watching as the dog paused, looking back at him before trotting ahead, leading him down the road like a guide. They traveled this way for miles, the shadowy figure cutting through the mist just ahead of his headlights. Mac didn't know why, but he trusted the dog, following it without question. It led him down a familiar stretch, where Route 66 narrowed between two tall bluffs, winding treacherously through sharp curves. Suddenly, the dog stopped and looked back at Mac, its eyes piercing through the darkness. Mac slowed to a stop, confused, but as he looked around, he realized why it had led him here. In the opposite lane, a semi-truck was approaching fast, its lights barely visible through the thick fog. But something was off. The truck was weaving slightly, its headlights occasionally dipping as if the driver were nodding off. Mac flashed his lights and blasted his horn, and the approaching truck jolted, barely regaining control. The other driver quickly righted his vehicle, barely making it past Mac's rig before swerving back into his own lane. As the truck passed, the shadow dog turned, giving Mac a final, knowing look before disappearing into the fog. The next day, Mac felt compelled to return to the roadside plaque. This time, he brought a bouquet of wildflowers, laying them at the base as a quiet offering. He stood there for a long time, lost in thought, feeling an unspoken bond with Joey and his loyal dog. That night, as he drove past the spot where he'd left the flowers, he noticed something unusual. A small, scruffy dog, a real, flesh-and-blood animal, was sitting by the roadside, looking up at him as he passed. It had the same piercing, intelligent eyes as the shadow dog. Mac slowed, his heart racing as he watched it from his rearview mirror. But when he stopped the truck and stepped out, the dog was gone. From that day forward, Mac drove with a renewed sense of caution and respect. He never saw the shadow dog again, but he always felt its presence, as if it were watching over him, guiding him on his journeys. In time, Mac's story became one of the many legends told by truckers along Route 66. Some scoffed, dismissing it as a tall tale, but others took it to heart. To them, the shadow dog was a reminder, a guardian spirit bound to the road, forever watching over those who dared to travel its dark, foggy stretches at night. Somewhere out there, in the mists of Route 66, a loyal dog named Sam and his master Joey kept vigil, their spirits intertwined, eternally bound to protect those who needed saving. Story 2. The Howl in the Hollow Woods. 1. Arrival and Warnings. A group of friends, Sarah, Mark, Danielle, and Tom, arrive in a small town on the edge of the Pacific Northwest forests, eager for an autumn camping trip. They stop by a local gas station to buy supplies, where the attendant, a grizzled old man named Bill, warns them to avoid the hollow woods after dark. He speaks in hushed tones about an old legend, saying that anyone who hears the howls of the spectral pack should turn back immediately. The friends laugh it off, thinking it's just a local scare tactic to spook tourists. 2. Setting up camp. the friends trek into the hollow woods, a dense, moss-covered forest that feels timeless, untouched by civilization. Tall fir trees tower overhead, and the air is thick with the scent of earth and pine. They find a small clearing near a stream and set up their tents. As they relax around the campfire that night, they joke about Bill's warnings, trading ghost stories to get each other into the Halloween spirit. 3. The first howl. As the fire dies down, they begin hearing faint howling from deep within the woods. It starts as a low, mournful sound, distant but unmistakable. The group quiets, thinking it's just wolves or coyotes. But then the howling grows closer and louder, with an eerie, almost otherworldly quality that sends chills down their spines. Sarah suggests it could be a trick of the wind, but Tom, who's been on many camping trips, looks worried. He insists they all stay close to the fire. 4. Growing tension and curiosity. As the night progresses, the howls seem to circle their camp, never coming closer, yet never moving away either. Mark becomes intrigued, thinking it could be a rare chance to see a wolf pack in action. Ignoring his friend's protests, he grabs a flashlight and heads toward the sound, determined to catch a glimpse of the creatures. Danielle, feeling uneasy, convinces the others to follow him to ensure he doesn't get lost. 5. The encounter. They venture deeper into the woods, the darkness almost suffocating around them. As they follow Mark, the howls become louder, echoing off the trees and surrounding them. They finally reach a ridge where the land drops into a misty valley, and there, in the moonlight, they see a spectral pack of wolves. Their bodies are semi-translucent, with eyes that glint like embers. At the head of the pack is a giant, ghostly dog, larger than any wolf they'd ever seen, with piercing, white eyes that seem to look right into their souls. 6. Realization and panic. The friends realize that the creatures are not ordinary animals, they are spirits or apparitions. Sarah recalls the warning from the gas station attendant and whispers it to the others, but it's too late. The giant ghost dog lets out a deep, haunting howl, signaling the spectral wolves to start advancing toward them. Fear grips the group as they realize the wolves are driving them toward the edge of the ridge, trapping them. 7. Desperate escape. Tom suggests they try to run back the way they came, hoping to lose the spectral pack in the denser part of the woods. They sprint through the forest, dodging low branches and leaping over roots, with the ghostly wolves in pursuit. As they flee, they hear the giant dog's howl echoing around them, pushing them further into the forest. Their flashlights flicker, and the shadows seem to stretch and close in around them. 8. The lost clearing. The group stumbles into a small, forgotten clearing, where an old, crumbling cabin stands. They rush inside, barricading the door with whatever they can find. Inside, they find remnants of an old hunting lodge, a broken rifle, faded photographs of hunters with their dogs, and strange symbols carved into the walls. Sarah recognizes the symbols as protection wards, and they realize the cabin once belonged to someone who knew of the spectral pack. 9. Ghostly revelation. Inside the cabin, the friends catch their breath. But as they examine the faded photographs, they make a chilling discovery. The giant dog that leads the spectral pack is in one of the photos, standing proudly beside an old hunter. They realize that this hunter must have died here, and his loyal dog now leads the ghostly pack, guarding the forest from those who trespass on its grounds. They piece together the legend. The hunter was supposedly cursed for killing the alpha of a wolf pack, and his spirit and that of his dog were bound to the forest to protect it in death. 10. Final confrontation and escape. Just as they begin to feel a glimmer of hope, a loud scratching sound comes from the door. The giant ghost dog is outside, its eyes visible through the cracks in the wood, watching them with a mixture of sadness and warning. They hear the wolves howling in unison, surrounding the cabin. Desperate, Danielle recalls one of the protection symbols from a horror movie and scratches it into the door with her pocket knife, hoping to create a barrier. The spectral pack grows quiet, seemingly deterred by the symbol. Seizing the opportunity, they break a back window and scramble out, racing toward the edge of the woods. As they run, they hear one final, mournful howl from the giant dog, as if it's releasing them from the forest's grip. 11. Returning to town. The friends finally emerge from the forest, exhausted and shaken. They make their way back to town, where Bill is waiting at the gas station. He doesn't look surprised to see them, only nods knowingly as they recount their experience. "You were lucky," he says quietly. "They don't let just anyone leave." Bill explains that the ghostly pack was once a real one that protected the forest centuries ago, and the giant dog was a hunting hound, cursed to lead the spirits of the wolves it helped hunt in life. Every few years, campers report the howling, and not all of them come back. 12. Epilogue. The friends leave town the next day, the weight of their experience hanging heavily on them. As they drive away, they hear one last faint howl from the hollow woods, a haunting reminder that some legends are more than just stories. They don't speak of it again, each knowing that whatever they'd encountered in those woods would remain with them, in their memories and nightmares. This story format balances suspense, eerie encounters, and character reactions to build a satisfying horror experience. The lore adds depth to the haunting, making the spectral pack not only terrifying but also tragic, with the giant dog both a protector and a reminder of the forest's dark past. Let me know if you'd like a deeper focus on any specific scenes or additional character perspectives. Story 3. Old Man McGregor's Hound. 1. The Legend of Old Man McGregor. The small town of Willow Creek held many secrets, but none more unsettling than the tale of Old Man McGregor and his hound, Harker. McGregor, a miserly and hard-hearted farmer, was infamous for his rough ways. Stories passed down through the town painted him as a man with little love for anyone, including his loyal dog, Harker, a great black hound who had faithfully served him since he was a pup. As the legend went, McGregor treated Harker poorly, forcing him to guard the fields at all hours, through rain, snow, and heat, often with little food or shelter. Rumors spread that McGregor would kick or strike the dog when he thought no one was watching. The townsfolk murmured disapprovingly, but McGregor's farm was isolated, and his cruelty went largely unchecked. Then, one night, the town was shocked to hear that McGregor had vanished. His house was found deserted, and the farm animals roamed freely. The only thing the neighbors discovered were enormous claw marks raked into the walls of McGregor's barn. No one could find Harker, and no one ever saw McGregor again. But after that night, people said a massive, dark hound would appear on misty evenings, stalking the farmland and watching any who dared to trespass. 2. A new family moves in. Years passed, and McGregor's farm remained empty and overgrown. Locals avoided it, believing it cursed. But eventually, a young family from out of town bought the land, hoping to start a new life. The parents, Jake and Lisa Taylor, saw the property as a charming, rustic retreat where they could raise their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, and their beloved German Shepherd, Max. The locals greeted them warmly but warned them to treat any animals on the farm kindly, particularly after hearing about Max. Jake and Lisa chuckled politely at the superstitions, dismissing them as small-town ghost stories. Emma, however, was captivated by the tales. The idea of a ghost dog roaming her new home thrilled her young imagination. For the first few weeks, life on McGregor's farm was peaceful. Jake and Lisa focused on repairs, cleaning up the old farmhouse, and exploring the property. Max, usually brave, seemed uneasy on the farm, occasionally growling at empty air or refusing to go near the barn. They thought it was just an adjustment period for him, but soon, strange occurrences began to unfold. 3. The disappearance of Max. One evening, Emma came running to her parents in tears. She had been playing with Max by the barn when she went inside briefly to grab a ball. When she returned, Max was gone. They called for him all night, but there was no sign of him. They searched the property and even checked with neighbors, but it was as if Max had vanished into thin air. Heartbroken and puzzled, Emma spent days wandering the fields, calling out for her dog. One night, as she was heading back inside, she saw large, dark shapes moving at the edge of the fields. She squinted but couldn't make out what they were. But she felt a prickle of fear that sent her running inside. Then the claw marks appeared. 4. Claw marks on the walls. A few days after Max's disappearance, Jake noticed something alarming on the side of the barn. Deep scratches, much larger than any animal's claws, were etched into the wood, raking down from the roof to the ground. At first, he thought they might be from a bear, though Willow Creek wasn't known for having many. But the claw marks grew more frequent. Soon, they appeared on the house itself, near windows and doors, as if something had been trying to get inside. The family's unease grew as more strange events unfolded. They heard low, mournful howls at night, unlike any animal cry they knew. Sometimes, they'd glimpse a dark shadow prowling the edges of the property, too large and swift to be a wolf or stray dog. 5. Emma's encounter. One cold, misty morning, Emma woke up early, feeling restless. She looked out her bedroom window, where the fog hung low over the fields, giving the land an eerie, silver sheen. Just then, she saw a figure standing in the field, a huge, black hound with gleaming eyes that stared directly up at her. She gasped, feeling both fear and an odd familiarity, as if the dog were somehow connected to Max. The hound didn't move, just watched her, unblinking. Its eyes seemed sad but filled with a warning. As Emma stared at it, she heard a voice in her mind, low and growling, "Be kind to those who protect." Before she could even process the thought, the hound disappeared into the mist. She ran to her parents, telling them about the dog. Jake, now concerned for their safety, decided it was time to find out more about the farm's history. 6. Learning the truth. Jake visited the local library, hoping to find more about Old Man McGregor. Through some digging, he unearthed a series of old newspaper articles detailing McGregor's reputation for cruelty. It confirmed that he had been rough on animals, but Jake found something else. The townsfolk had always wondered what had happened to McGregor and Harker. Some believed McGregor's spirit was trapped on the farm, and Harker, his mistreated hound, had taken vengeance on his cruel master, leading him into the unknown. According to one account, people claimed Harker's spirit still roamed the farm, warning off those who might harm animals or disturb the land. Jake read that anyone who showed cruelty to animals, even unknowingly, would be marked by Harker's claw marks as a warning. 7. A midnight confrontation. That night, as the family huddled together, the howling returned, closer than ever. They heard scratching at the door, as if something large were pacing outside. When Jake peeked through the window, he saw it, the enormous black hound, Harker, staring right at him. Its eyes were intense, filled with both accusation and sorrow. Jake realized that the dog was searching for Max, for any sign that they had treated their own pet with kindness and care. In a moment of desperation, Jake stepped outside, his voice shaky but determined. "Harker," he called, "we loved Max, and we'd never harm an animal. Please, help us find him." The hound stood still, its ears perked as it listened. For a long moment, it simply watched Jake. Then, as if satisfied, it turned and padded toward the barn, disappearing into the shadows. 8. Max's return. The next morning, Emma was woken by the sound of familiar barking. She scrambled out of bed, racing downstairs and out the front door. There, bounding toward her, was Max, alive and unharmed. He was thinner and a bit dirtier, but otherwise fine. Emma hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. Jake and Lisa, relieved and overjoyed, watched as Max trotted back to the barn, sniffing around the spot where he had last been seen. As he did, the family noticed that the claw marks on the barn and the house had begun to fade, as though wiped away by an invisible hand. 9. A final warning. The family never saw the hound again, but they continued to feel its presence. Late at night, they would hear distant howls, as if Harker were reminding them of his watchful gaze over the land. They treated the farm with care, respecting the wild animals that roamed it and giving shelter to strays that wandered by. In time, the townsfolk noticed the change. The Taylors became known as kind-hearted caretakers of the farm, a sharp contrast to Old Man McGregor. Emma, in particular, grew up with a love for animals and a respect for the land that went beyond her years. Years later, as she prepared to leave for college, she looked back at the farmhouse one last time and thought she saw a shape in the fog, a dark, towering dog, watching her with familiar, gleaming eyes. She smiled, feeling a sense of peace, as though she were being guided forward by a guardian spirit from her childhood. From then on, Willow Creek's tale of Old Man McGregor's hound continued, but with a kinder ending. The legend remained a reminder to all who lived there, to respect the animals, the land, and the loyal spirits that watched over them. This story builds a ghostly legend with suspense and redemption, weaving in the vengeful hound's protective nature and the family's growth into caretakers of the land and its creatures. Let me know if you'd like to explore any specific elements or add more detail. Story 4. The Hound on the Hill. 1. The fraternity's tradition. Every fall, Gamma Alpha fraternity at Hollow Ridge College initiates its new pledges with an infamous challenge, a midnight trip to Willow Hill. The hill, shadowed by thick, twisted trees and crowned by the ruins of an old stone cabin, is known for its dark legend. Locals say a spectral hound guards the spirits of two lovers who died tragically there. Fraternity brothers recount stories of hearing low growls and seeing a hulking, shadowy figure watching them through the trees, only to disappear when they blink. The pledges, Tom, Eric, Marco, and Jake, laugh nervously as they listen to the story during their induction meeting. They're skeptical, assuming it's just another ghost story cooked up to scare new recruits. Still, the legend sticks with them as they prepare for their journey to Willow Hill the following night. 2. The Legend of Willow Hill. According to the tale, decades ago, two young lovers, Amelia and Henry, used to meet on Willow Hill, away from disapproving families and prying eyes. Henry, the son of a wealthy businessman, fell deeply in love with Amelia, a farmer's daughter. They'd made a plan to elope one night under a full moon. But before they could, they were found by Amelia's father, who in his fury struck out at Henry. During the struggle, both fell to their deaths at the edge of the hill. Devastated, Amelia's loyal hound, a large black dog named Shadow, stood vigil at the spot where the lovers had met. Days later, the townspeople found the dog lying beside the lovers' graves, refusing to leave. Eventually, Shadow passed, but his spirit was said to remain, guarding the resting place of the young lovers and haunting those who disturbed their hill. Gamma Alpha brothers insist the hill is haunted and that Shadow still prowls the area, a spectral guardian of the lovers' tragic tale. But no one really knows what's true. 3. The initiation begins. When the night arrives, the pledges gather with flashlights, wrapped in hoodies against the autumn chill. The brothers lead them up to the hill, the forest around them dense and oppressive. Fraternity members wait at the bottom of the hill, watching the pledges ascend, calling out last-minute warnings about the Hound of Willow Hill. Tom, the most skeptical of the group, leads the way, determined to prove he's not afraid. Eric follows close behind, whispering jokes to keep everyone's spirits up. Jake, however, seems uneasy, his eyes darting around as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. As they approach the top, the ruins of the old cabin loom in the moonlight, casting eerie shadows over the hill. The pledges nervously settle near the edge, ready to complete the initiation. Just then, a strange sound cuts through the night air, a low, deep growl that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. 4. A first glimpse of the hound. The growl is quickly followed by a rustling in the trees. Marco nervously swings his flashlight, illuminating twisted branches and shifting shadows. "It's just a trick," he mutters, trying to sound convincing. But his voice wavers, betraying his fear. Jake stiffens, his flashlight catching something in the distance, two gleaming eyes that reflect back in an unnatural shade of silver. The figure is massive, a hulking shape low to the ground, with a pair of broad, muscular shoulders visible in the moonlight. It's too large to be any ordinary dog, and it doesn't move like one either. Instead, it slinks forward with a chilling calmness, as if it knows the pledges can't leave. Panic starts to spread. Tom, attempting to rationalize, says it must be a prank, a brother in a costume, maybe. But the others aren't so sure. They realize the brothers never actually mentioned anyone coming up to the hill after them. And the creature's eyes, those gleaming eyes, feel far too real. 5. Trapped by the spectral hound. The hound circles them, staying just beyond the reach of their flashlights, each growl reverberating in their bones. They huddle together, backing up toward the ruined cabin. Eric tries to call out to the other fraternity members, but his voice is swallowed by the night. The silence that follows each bark and growl is deafening, pressing down on them as they feel the creature's presence closing in. Just as Tom inches back, his foot catches on something half buried in the earth. When he bends down, he realizes it's a tattered leather collar, large and worn, with a metal tag scratched and faded. The only letters still visible spell Esiche, the first letters of Shadow. His throat tightens. Whatever doubts he had vanish, and he can feel the truth settling over him like a fog. This is no prank. A sudden snarl erupts from the shadows, and the hound steps into the light, a massive, spectral figure, with thick black fur that seems to blend with the darkness. Its eyes glow with a ghostly intensity, and its teeth, sharp and gleaming, are bared in a snarl. The pledges are frozen, their minds screaming at them to run, but their bodies paralyzed by terror. 6. Desperation and escape. Finally, Marco snaps out of his trance and shouts, "Run!" They scatter, sprinting down the hill with the hound in pursuit. The beast moves like a shadow, silent and swift, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. They can feel it right behind them, each growl resonating like a warning, its breath icy as it brushes past them. The hill seems to stretch out, each step down feeling longer than the last, as though the ground itself is keeping them there. Eric trips and falls, skidding to a stop, his flashlight rolling out of reach. As he scrambles up, the hound looms over him, its gaze locking onto his. But just as he braces for the worst, the hound stops, sniffing the air, as though recognizing something in him. With a final snarl, it turns and slinks back into the shadows, sparing him. 7. Reaching the bottom. By the time the pledges reach the bottom of the hill, they're gasping for breath, faces pale. The fraternity brothers who had waited for them look on in confusion and concern, unsure what's happened. The pledges struggle to explain the horror they witnessed, their words tumbling over each other as they try to describe the spectral hound's glowing eyes and snarling face. Some brothers laugh it off, thinking the pledges are playing along with the legend. But one of the older fraternity members, Ryan, goes quiet, his face pale. He's heard whispers from his grandfather, a local, about the Hound of Willow Hill and the lover's tragic story. And he knows that the hound is no myth. He warns the others that the hill and the spirits that haunt it aren't to be trifled with. 8. The final warning. After that night, the pledges avoid Willow Hill, their experience too vivid to be dismissed as a prank or a hazing scare. They catch themselves glancing up at the hill's shadowy outline, shivering at the thought of those spectral eyes. The fraternity's tradition continues, but with a new cautionary note. Ryan, now one of the fraternity elders, warns new members that the hound doesn't tolerate disrespect to its hill. He tells them that the hill is a sacred place, haunted by a love that never found peace and a hound who remains loyal to its fallen masters. And on misty nights, as the moon casts eerie shadows on Willow Hill, a dark, silent figure is sometimes seen pacing back and forth, guarding the hilltop. It is the silent, spectral hound, Shadow, watching over the resting place of the young lovers, forever loyal and forever waiting. Story 5. Ghost Dog of the Woodshed. 1. The Old House and the Scratching Sounds. The Thompson family moved into their new home on the outskirts of town with a mix of excitement and trepidation. The house was old, charmingly rustic, and had once belonged to a farmer known for his frugality and sternness. Along with the creaky floorboards and dim lighting, the property included a dilapidated woodshed in the backyard. The shed, a rickety structure barely holding itself together, seemed long forgotten, with ivy creeping over its walls and the smell of damp earth surrounding it. The Thompsons, Mark, his wife Sarah, and their 2 children, Ellie and Jack, settled in quickly, eager to transform the property into a cozy family home. For the first few days, everything seemed perfect. But as night fell, they began to hear strange noises, a scratching sound that seemed to come from the shed. At first, they brushed it off as branches brushing against the shed in the wind or the sounds of raccoons scurrying around. But the scratching persisted, night after night, and only grew louder. 2. Curiosity turns to unease. Mark, a logical man, decided to investigate, convinced there had to be a simple explanation. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured into the backyard one night, approaching the shed cautiously. But as soon as he stepped closer, the scratching stopped. He scanned the area, even looking inside the shed, finding nothing but old, rusted tools, some dusty wood, and the remnants of what seemed to be an old chain tied to a post in the corner. He called back to Sarah that it was probably an animal and that there was nothing to worry about. However, he couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was watching him as he walked back to the house. The scratching resumed the following night, and this time, it was accompanied by low, whining sounds, almost like the soft cries of a dog. Sarah, Ellie, and Jack heard it too. It was unsettling and filled the house with an inexplicable sadness that lingered long after the sound stopped. 3. Discovering the shed's dark secret. One afternoon, Ellie, a curious and sensitive teenager, decided to explore the woodshed on her own. She had been feeling drawn to it, as if something inside was calling her. When she entered, she noticed the chain Mark had mentioned, a thick, rusty chain, with an old collar still attached to the end of it, lying half buried in the dirt. As Ellie touched the collar, a sudden chill filled the shed, and a feeling of despair washed over her, bringing tears to her eyes. She could almost feel the presence of something lonely and suffering, as though it were lingering just out of sight. Ellie ran back to the house, telling her parents about the strange sensations she'd felt, but Mark dismissed it as an overactive imagination. Sarah, however, sensed there might be something more to it. Curious, Sarah began asking around town about the house and the previous owner, an elderly man named Walter Griggs, who had passed away a few years ago. She learned from a neighbor that Griggs had kept to himself, known to be harsh and frugal. And then, an unsettling detail emerged. He'd owned a large dog named Rusty, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The townspeople never talked much about it, but some whispered that the dog had met an unfortunate end. Griggs had been seen tying Rusty up in the woodshed, where he would often leave him for hours, even in harsh weather. Some believed that Rusty had died there, forgotten and alone, tied to that very chain Ellie had found. 4. The dog's spirit revealed. That night, the scratching intensified, echoing through the house. The whining sounds became louder, more desperate, almost as if a dog was trapped in the backyard, seeking help. Ellie, unable to ignore the pitiful sounds, convinced her family to go out to the shed with her, flashlights in hand. As they approached, a sudden chill swept over them, and the air felt heavy. Mark opened the shed door, and the light from his flashlight illuminated the rusty chain and collar. Suddenly, they felt a presence, the feeling of being watched, and then, in the corner, a faint, shadowy figure appeared. It was the outline of a large dog, its shape barely visible, as though it were made of mist. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, filled with both sadness and a simmering anger. Sarah instinctively reached out, but the dog flinched, fading back into the shadows, leaving only the sound of its whimpering echoing in the shed. Ellie, with tears in her eyes, whispered, "It's Rusty, he's still here." 5. Seeking justice and peace. Sarah and Ellie knew they couldn't leave Rusty's spirit unrest. They wanted to help, but they didn't know how. The next day, they returned to the neighbor who had told them about Rusty, hoping for more details. The neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Palmer, sighed as she recounted what she knew. Walter Griggs was a hard man, Mrs. Palmer explained. He wasn't one for affection, even for his own dog. When Rusty grew old and couldn't work like he used to, Walter stopped caring for him. Some say he left him tied up in that shed, starving and alone. People tried to help, but Walter wouldn't listen. I guess that poor creature's spirit just couldn't find peace after that. With this heartbreaking story in mind, Sarah and Ellie returned home, determined to honor Rusty's memory. They decided to clean up the woodshed, hoping that restoring the space might help ease Rusty's lingering spirit. They removed the old chain, burying it near a tree in the yard, and planted a small garden around it, placing flowers and a simple marker that read, "Here rests Rusty, forever loved." That night, as the family gathered for dinner, they noticed a different feeling in the air, an unexpected calm. They went to bed with a sense of closure, believing they had done what they could to help Rusty. 6. A final visit. Just as they were drifting off to sleep, a soft barking woke them. Sarah, Mark, Ellie, and Jack all ventured outside together, each of them filled with an unspoken need to visit the garden one last time. There, by the little memorial they had made, stood the faint, misty figure of Rusty, his form clearer than before. His eyes, once sad and filled with anger, now looked peaceful. He wagged his tail slowly, and the family felt a wave of warmth, a silent thank you radiating from the spirit of the loyal dog. They watched as Rusty turned, walking away from the woodshed, fading into the night air until there was nothing left but a gentle rustling of leaves. 7. Peace restored. From that night on, the scratching sound stopped. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the woodshed lifted, and the Thompsons felt at ease in their home. They knew Rusty's spirit had finally found peace, released from the suffering he had endured in life. In the following weeks, Ellie would often spend time in the garden, talking softly as though Rusty could still hear her. And on quiet, misty mornings, when the sunlight just barely touched the ground, she sometimes felt the brush of a soft breeze, as though a dog's fur were brushing past her, and she knew Rusty was still there, his spirit finally at rest, forever grateful for the family who had freed him from his tragic past. Epilogue. The Thompsons never forgot Rusty's story, passing it down as a tale of love, loyalty, and redemption. They took in a rescue dog, naming him Rusty in honor of the ghost dog who had watched over their home. And every now and then, at dusk, a distant bark could be heard echoing from the woodshed, a reminder of the loyal hound who had finally found peace. Story 6. The Watchdog of Pine Valley High. 1. The Legend of Max. Pine Valley High had always held a reputation as a place of history and old stories, but one legend stood above the rest, the tale of Max, the loyal Doberman. Generations of students knew Max's story, a formidable watchdog tasked with protecting the school during the 1970s, a time when vandalism and trespassing were common. Max had been more than just a guard dog. He'd been a part of the Pine Valley community, beloved by teachers, respected by students, and feared by anyone with ill intentions. Every night, as dusk fell, Max would walk the hallways with his owner, Old Joe, the head janitor at the time. Max was known for his keen senses, and anyone who encountered him knew not to cross him. But in his later years, Max's health declined, and one autumn night, he passed away peacefully in the school's detention room, a place he often rested in after his rounds. Following Max's death, rumors began to spread. Late-night staff members and custodians claimed to hear the faint sound of chains clinking, followed by soft growls echoing down the hallways. Students whispered that Max's spirit never left and that he continued to keep watch over Pine Valley High, especially in the detention room, where his loyalty to the school had anchored him even after death. 2. The Janitor's Warning. Years later, Mr. Raymond, the current school janitor, would often recount the tale of Max to the students, especially those serving detention. Mr. Raymond had worked at Pine Valley for decades and swore he'd felt Max's presence on multiple occasions. His story became a rite of passage for new students, who were both frightened and fascinated by the ghostly dog that supposedly roamed the halls. "Don't think Max is just some old story," Mr. Raymond would say, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. "I've heard his growl myself. Felt the cold draft that follows him. He guards the detention room to this day, watching over students who misbehave, making sure no one's up to trouble." He'd add, "If you ever feel a sudden chill or hear chains rattling, don't go looking. It's just Max doing his rounds." Most of the students would roll their eyes, chalking it up to another ghost story. But every now and then, someone would leave detention feeling a little more nervous, casting a glance over their shoulder as they exited the room, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes in the shadows. 3. A Strange Night for Sam. One stormy October evening, Sam Parker, a senior, found himself serving detention alone. He'd been caught skipping class, and his punishment was a solitary evening in the detention room. The thunderstorm outside made the old school building feel more ominous than usual, each lightning strike casting eerie shadows through the narrow windows. Mr. Raymond stopped by to lock up the other rooms and, as usual, reminded Sam about Max. "Better behave yourself, Sam. he said with a chuckle. Max doesn't like troublemakers. Sam rolled his eyes, chuckling to himself as Mr. Raymond left. He'd heard the story of Max countless times, and while he didn't believe it, he had to admit that the thought of an old ghost dog roaming the halls was unsettling. As the hour dragged on, Sam tried to focus on his homework, the sound of rain and thunder filling the room. But then, faintly, he heard something else, a soft, metallic clinking, like chains dragging along the floor. At first, he brushed it off as the old building settling or maybe even the sound of pipes in the walls. But the noise grew louder, closer. Then, suddenly, it stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Sam's heart pounded as he glanced toward the door, half expecting to see Mr. Raymond playing a prank. But there was no one there. The room felt colder, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Dismissing it as his mind playing tricks on him, he tried to go back to his homework. But the feeling of unease lingered. For, the growl in the shadows. A few minutes later, Sam heard a low growl, deep and guttural, vibrating through the silence of the room. His heart skipped a beat as he looked around, trying to locate the source. The growl echoed, bouncing off the walls, as if surrounding him. He swallowed, gripping his pencil tightly, every nerve in his body alert. "Okay, who's there?" he called out, attempting to sound confident, though his voice betrayed a tremor. He stood, slowly moving toward the door. But just as he reached for the handle, he felt a blast of icy air brush past him, freezing him in place. The growl sounded again, this time right behind him, too close for comfort. Turning slowly, Sam saw nothing but shadows. But his heart raced as he noticed a faint, spectral outline near the corner of the room, the shape of a large dog, barely visible, but unmistakable. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, watching him with a strange mix of curiosity and warning. Paralyzed with fear, Sam didn't dare move, his eyes locked on the ghostly figure. The dog's gaze was intense, as though it were evaluating him, deciding if he was friend or foe. After what felt like an eternity, the apparition turned and disappeared into the wall, leaving only the sound of chains rattling in its wake. 5. The staff's encounter. The next day, Sam recounted his experience to his friends, who laughed, brushing it off as a prank or an overactive imagination. But when Mr. Raymond heard about it, he nodded knowingly. "Max doesn't show himself to just anyone, you know. He must have thought you were worth the warning." Sam felt chills at Mr. Raymond's words. He hadn't believed in ghosts before, but the encounter had left him questioning everything he thought he knew. Over the next few weeks, he tried to avoid the detention room, but strange occurrences continued. Staff members working late at night reported hearing growls and the sound of chains clinking down the hallways, especially near the old classrooms and the basement where Max and old Joe once made their rounds. One evening, Ms. Davis, the English teacher, was grading papers in her classroom when she heard a soft scratching at the door. Thinking it was a stray animal, she opened it cautiously, only to find the hallway empty. She returned to her desk, trying to shake off the eerie feeling, when suddenly she felt a cold presence beside her. The room grew unnaturally cold, and she heard a faint growl, causing her to bolt out of the classroom, leaving her papers behind. After that night, stories about Max's ghostly presence spread among the teachers, some skeptical, others more willing to believe. Ms. Davis even confessed that she'd seen a faint outline of a dog one night, though she rarely spoke of it, preferring not to relive the chilling experience. 6. A final test of loyalty. One evening, a group of students decided to test the legend, sneaking into the detention room after hours. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they laughed and joked, daring each other to call for Max. "Come on, Max. Show yourself," one of the boys taunted, tapping his flashlight against the desk. The others joined in, jeering and mocking the story of the ghost dog, daring each other to stay in the room alone. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. The temperature in the room dropped, and an unsettling silence filled the air. The students' flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then, they heard it, a low, menacing growl, echoing through the room, followed by the distinct sound of chains dragging across the floor. Panic set in as the students felt the intense gaze of something unseen. Their flashlights flickered again, and in the brief moments of darkness, they caught glimpses of a large, shadowy figure moving toward them. The dog's eyes glowed faintly, filled with an intensity that left no room for doubt. They were intruding on its territory. Screaming, the students bolted out of the room, dropping their flashlights and abandoning their cameras. As they fled, one of them looked back and saw the faint outline of Max, his head held high, his stance firm, as if standing guard over his school, warning them not to return. 7. A lasting legacy. After that night, the students didn't dare speak of their encounter, their faces pale with fear whenever someone mentioned the detention room. Rumors of Max's ghostly presence continued to circulate, and even the more skeptical staff members grew cautious about staying late, especially near the detention room. Mr. Raymond, however, took solace in the stories. He saw Max as more than a ghost. To him, Max was a reminder of loyalty, a silent guardian watching over Pine Valley High. He would often place a treat in the detention room, a gesture of respect for his old friend, knowing that some bonds are too strong to be broken, even by death. And on quiet nights, when the halls were empty and the school lay silent, the faint sound of chains clinking and the soft padding of paws could still be heard, a testament to the loyal watchdog who refused to abandon his post. Epilogue. The tale of Max, the ghostly Doberman of Pine Valley High, became more than just a legend. It was a part of the school's history, a story passed down with each graduating class, reminding students of the loyalty of a faithful friend who guarded his territory even in death. And though Max's spirit may never rest, those who knew his story felt a strange comfort, knowing that he was always watching, ensuring that Pine Valley High remained safe under his vigilant eye. Story 7. Bloodhound at the Broken Bridge. 1. The Legend of the Broken Bridge. The old bridge on the outskirts of Shelby County, Alabama, had been abandoned for decades. Once a key route for travelers and locals, it had fallen into disrepair after a series of tragic accidents. Locals said the bridge was cursed, haunted by the spirit of a bloodhound that had once belonged to the town sheriff. The sheriff had used the dog, named Rufus, to track criminals through the dense woods and fields surrounding the county. Rufus was known for his loyalty and skill, unmatched by any other bloodhound in the area. One stormy night, while chasing a notorious fugitive, Rufus went missing. Some claimed the fugitive had tried to cross the bridge during the chase, but the decaying planks gave way, sending him and the loyal bloodhound into the murky waters below. Only the fugitive's body was found. Rufus's body was never recovered. Since that night, townsfolk whispered that on foggy evenings, when the air hung thick and heavy, the ghost of Rufus could be seen haunting the bridge, his ghostly presence seeking his master, still tracking those who dared cross his path. 2. A shortcut home. One evening, a young couple, Emily and Jake, were driving home after a long day visiting family. They were eager to get home, but a thick fog had settled over the country roads, making it difficult to see. Jake, trying to save time, suggested taking a shortcut across the old bridge. "It'll shave off 20 minutes, he said, glancing at Emily, who gave him a wary look. "You know that bridge is supposed to be haunted, right?" Emily asked, half joking, though the mist and darkness made the thought more unsettling than usual. "Come on, it's just a story," Jake laughed, brushing off her concerns. "Besides, I don't believe in ghost dogs." Emily chuckled nervously, but her unease lingered as they turned onto the narrow road leading to the bridge. The fog grew denser, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to loom closer, their branches casting eerie shadows across the path. As they approached the bridge, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The broken planks and rusty rails stood in stark contrast to the fog, giving the bridge an almost otherworldly appearance. She clutched her seatbelt, feeling a strange urge to turn back. But Jake was already steering the car onto the bridge. 3. The first signs. As they drove across the creaking planks, the mist thickened, muffling the sound of the tires on the wood. They were halfway across when Emily thought she heard a faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps on gravel, cutting through the silence. She dismissed it as a trick of the fog or her mind playing tricks on her, but then she heard it again, steady, purposeful, and growing louder. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the eerie quiet. "Hear what?" Jake asked, his brow furrowed as he slowed the car slightly. The sound was unmistakable now, the low thud of heavy paws hitting the ground, coming toward them at a steady pace. Emily's heart raced, her eyes scanning the fog-shrouded bridge. And then, just beyond the beams of their headlights, she saw it, a large, shadowy figure moving toward them, its form slowly becoming clearer. It was a bloodhound, its shape almost translucent, with glowing, mournful eyes fixed directly on their car. The dog's body seemed to waver in and out of sight, like it was part of the fog itself, but its presence was unmistakable. Its eyes shone with a cold, eerie intensity, and a low, rumbling growl seemed to resonate through the air. For a terrifying chase. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp as Jake caught sight of the spectral bloodhound, now closing in on them. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his face pale. "Hold on," he muttered, pressing his foot down on the gas. The car lurched forward, but as they sped up, the bloodhound matched their pace, its form growing clearer with each step. Jake tried to shake off his nerves, but the dog's relentless pursuit was unnerving. The fog swirled around them, but Rufus moved through it effortlessly, his ghostly paws making no sound against the bridge's planks, his eyes locked onto the car with an intensity that sent shivers down their spines. As the dog drew closer, Emily swore she heard the faint jingle of a chain, as if Rufus was still tethered to his past life, bound to the bridge by an unseen force. Her breathing quickened, and she gripped Jake's arm. "Go faster. He's getting closer." Jake floored the gas pedal, the car surging forward, but Rufus stayed right behind them, his figure growing sharper, more real, as though he were becoming more than just a ghost. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him in the side mirror, his eyes glowing brighter, his jaws parted slightly as if he were preparing to lunge. 5. Near disaster. As they neared the end of the bridge, the dog's speed increased, his pace relentless and unyielding. Emily dared to glance back, her heart racing as she saw Rufus only a few feet from the bumper. The car swerved as Jake's hands trembled on the wheel, the fog making it hard to see anything clearly. "Jake, keep going," she screamed, her voice tinged with fear. The dog's growl grew louder, filling the car with a bone-chilling sound, a haunting blend of anger and sorrow. They were nearly off the bridge when a sharp turn loomed ahead. Jake, panicked and blinded by the fog, turned the wheel too hard. The car skidded, tires screeching as they barely avoided the edge, coming dangerously close to sliding off the broken railing into the dark waters below. The sudden movement seemed to startle Rufus, who stopped abruptly, his glowing eyes watching them with a mournful gaze. The car steadied as Jake regained control, but the bloodhound remained, standing at the edge of the bridge, his head low, his eyes filled with an inexplicable sadness. For a moment, Emily felt a pang of pity for the ghostly creature. Rufus didn't seem angry, he seemed trapped, bound to the bridge, doomed to chase after anyone who crossed it. She wondered if he was still searching for his master, the sheriff, who had long since passed, or if he was driven by some other lingering sorrow. 6. Escaping the bridge. As the car finally reached solid ground, Jake accelerated, not daring to look back. They sped down the road, leaving the bridge and its ghostly guardian behind, the fog gradually thinning as they moved farther away. After a few minutes, Jake slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road. They sat in stunned silence, the reality of their encounter settling in. Emily's hands were still trembling, and her breath came in short gasps as she tried to calm herself. Did you see him?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Jake nodded, his face pale. "I did. And I don't think I ever want to see him again." They sat there for a while, the sounds of the night returning, filling the silence that had engulfed them on the bridge. But the memory of Rufus lingered, his mournful eyes, his determined chase, and the feeling that he was more than just a ghost. He was a soul bound to a place he couldn't leave, forced to haunt the bridge in search of something he'd never find. 7. A haunting memory. The couple returned to town, and while they shared their story with close friends, they found few willing to believe them. The bridge had a dark reputation, but few thought the legend of Rufus was anything more than a ghost story meant to scare teenagers. Only an older gentleman at a local diner seemed to take them seriously. He was a retired sheriff, and when he overheard their story, he nodded solemnly. Rufus was real, and he was the best bloodhound this town ever had, he said, his voice tinged with a mix of pride and sadness. Loyal to the end, that dog was. He got lost on the bridge during a chase and never came back. Folks say he's still searching for his master, bound to that bridge. The sheriff shook his head, a hint of sorrow in his eyes. Some spirits, they don't rest easy. Especially loyal ones. As the days passed, Emily and Jake tried to put the experience behind them, but the memory of Rufus haunted them. Sometimes, on misty nights, Emily would wake, hearing the faint sound of chains jingling in her dreams. The image of the ghostly bloodhound burned into her mind. 8. Epilogue, a final warning. From then on, the couple took a different route home, avoiding the bridge entirely. But the story of their encounter spread among the locals, and those who once saw the bridge as just an eerie landmark began to take its legends more seriously. Those who dared to cross the broken bridge at night often claimed to see a shadowy figure in the mist, a bloodhound with glowing eyes, his gaze filled with the same undying loyalty that had once defined him in life. And so, the bridge remained haunted, a place where the living and the lost could briefly intersect, united by the loyalty of a ghostly bloodhound, eternally watching, eternally searching, bound by a loyalty that even death couldn't break. If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.